All right, welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always.
No.
Too fast? Too clappy? God damn.
Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Michael Granado.
Special episode.
Stop touching me, Mike. We are in the same room together. And Raymond Perrier, who is joining us via a safe distance.
Yeah. How's it going, everybody? I believe last time this happened, you said I was joining you via a can and a string.
Yeah,
so
a can and a string.
I think I've made some moderate improvements.
We haven't.
No.
Yeah. No, Michael is still as grab-assy as always.
Yeah, we were in California last time this happened, and now I am in the dirty. I'm down in Savannah, Georgia.
The deep, dirty, stanky South.
That's true.
The sticky South.
The deep,
Yeah,
stanky.
sticky South.
Has it been humid for y'all? It's been nice over here.
No, it hasn't. It's actually nice right now. It's like cool. It's in like in the 60s.
It finally got below 80.
I know,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So, Jared, where are y'all at right now? Y'all are in outer Atlanta, or the Atlanta area.
Yeah, I don't want to disclose my location to the.
I mean, don't go like super detailed, but
He is at 346 Decatur Road.
Yeah, so we have made it back to the south, and so we are in the greater Atlanta area. Shout out to all the folks in ATL.
I put on for my city, on for my city.
oh my gosh.
Wait, is that Atlanta or is that the North Carolina guy?
Michael,
Pablo Petey.
are you
Yeah.
are you spritzing lemon juice into your beer instead of just putting a lemon in there or a lime?
Lime.
Lime juice, yes.
Yeah, dude. I come from the fucking trailer park. We can't afford no actual limes.
Actual limes are way cheaper than bottled lime juice.
Yeah,
Let's be honest.
they actually
That
are.
makes no sense.
They actually are cheaper. You get like $2 for $1.
Wait, were we supposed to be
man.
talking about something? Are we recording something?
Yeah. We are recording.
Raymond's supposed to be asking us weird questions.
Yeah, so we're doing a political AMA today. Ask me anything. Basically, because we're just trying to stay relevant, and also I'm interested in knowing what these guys over here are thinking politically these days.
Speaking of like relevant, I had no idea what AMA meant. I thought it was like the American Music Awards or something. And
Old ass man.
yeah, I don't speak like 4chan or whatever
It's
whatever
Reddit.
that is. I don't know.
4chan?
A hacker known as 4chan.
Jesus,
Good Lord.
I hate you all.
And if you're listening to this for our political opinion, you probably should not be listening to this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see if we can tie it into some philosophy.
Well, we've been listening. So Ray and I have been listening to Todd Snyder recently, and he said back at Farm Aid one of the past years. He said,
Shout out to Todd Snyder.
yeah, Todd. He might actually be listening to this of all the people in the world.
Who is Todd Snyder?
He's a folk singer, dude.
He's great. Check him out.
Anyway, he was at Farm Aid, and he prefaced his set by saying that, as a folk singer at this point in the performance, he likes to tell people, or warn people, I should say, that he's about to give some of his political opinions. And he says, I want to tell you, I'm not here to change anyone's opinion. I'm sharing these opinions not because they're smart, but because they rhyme.
Oh. So ours will neither be smart nor will they rhyme.
Correct. So they will be the absolute nadir.
They'll be filler.
They're things that exist in the world.
If you're bored and you need an hour,
Sure. Or if you just want something to rage about, right?
Yeah.
You say if you want to point out how wrong we are about things, that's okay too.
Yeah, let us know. Shoot us a email or
Send us an email that we definitely won't read.
I'll read it.
nobody has ever sent us an email.
Yeah, we haven't got a single fan letter yet.
Have you even checked? Because I sure have not checked that email since we set it up. So
Me and Michael check it every now and then. The thing is that the only people that actually support us are close friends, and so they just presume to text message us about these professional matters instead of going through proper channels anyways.
wait, you guys have friends?
Outside of you guys?
How do I get in on that?
And also, for the sake of clarification, the only person who supports us, shout out to Mark.
Shout out to Mark.
Mark.
I talk to on a somewhat regular basis.
You know how on like YouTube, whatever, if you have like a YouTuber, they'll name their patrons at the end of it, and it's like a scrolling thing. Ours is just a
Mark.
It's just a
Recent subs.
Every episode shout out to Mark.
It is.
Thanks again, Mark.
Thanks again, Mark. If you would like your name to be recognized on one of our episodes,
It's not the standards are so low.
If you would like the honor to be recognized by
3 random fuckers on the internet.
three of the least prestigious scholars there are.
oh my gosh.
I wear that badge with great honor, my friend.
Yeah.
My son is literally outside of the window to the room that we're in, sticking his tongue out at us.
Well, which I think is our cue.
That I've never been prouder as a parent. All right, well, you got questions?
I do. Some of them are pretty basic. We won't try and get too personal. We all know that I'm basic, but so let's just start with some basic information. You guys are both in Atlanta now, or in the Georgia area. You're in the Savannah area, right, Mike?
SAV.
Yeah, we've got an election coming up in less than 20 days now, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right thereabouts.
I've already voted.
You've already voted? Oh, wow. So some of the questions, one of them was a basic one, like, do you vote in our elections? And then why do you vote? Jared, you have already voted. Michael, do you plan to vote?
Honestly, me voting has less to do with my political convictions and has more to do with how well I've planned my time management for the week. So if it gets to voting day and I have like 30 essays to grade by the world's most awesome students, then I probably won't go. But if for whatever reason I have managed my schedule that week, I probably will. So yeah, less political, more practical.
Okay. So when you guys vote, why do you vote?
Well, as a resident anarchist, I am actually an outlier in my political camp in terms of my opinions on voting, because most anarchists don't vote. It's been my experience. Some of them just don't care, but others are actively opposed to people voting, which I think is kind of strange.
It's not very anarchist of them.
Yeah, it's not very live and let live, is it?
Yeah.
Anyway, leftists they can be a puritanical group. So as much as they rail against, white conservative Christians or whatnot, they have some puritanical tendencies on their own. I say that with love. Anyway, no, I think that voting for me is about damage control. It really is about mitigating risk, especially for marginalized people, because frankly, whether or not Team Red or Team Blue for the neoliberals wins is usually not that big of a deal. right? For me, especially, like if you're at the margins where fractional differences between the parties actually will impact your life much more than it will mine, then I think that you have to consider how that vote will potentially harm others. So, in other words, take a difference between like Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. There weren't many differences, or between George Bush and Al Gore, or just go down the list, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama. They're basically two different poles of the same party, the neoliberal party. There's very little actual difference between their policy initiatives, but they are marginally distinct enough to where I think it warrants going out for the day to make your voice known if it can potentially more positively impact someone who is legitimately at the margins, right?
Yeah, and I will say super quickly to that point, the last 5 years have probably been the most politically active I've ever been for that reason.
Now, I think that this election is actually different because it's not two neoliberals running against each other. It's a conservative neoliberal in the person of Joe Biden versus a grifter with fascist tendencies in the person of Donald Trump.
I would call him a nihilistic fascist.
Yes. Well, I'd say he's a grifter. I mean, he's at the end of the day, he's just about himself. He doesn't have a political ideology.
Yeah.
It almost strains credulity to even call him a fascist because fascist assumes that he has some political convictions, and he doesn't. He only has self-interest. But he is surrounding himself with people who are on the radical right, and so legitimately every 4 years we get the same bullshit about this is the most important election of your life, and that's almost certainly never the case. This election does feel different. It feels important just again because another 4 years of Donald Trump feels like it would be catastrophic for people at the margins. It would be catastrophic for the planet, and it would be catastrophic for whatever minor semblance of democracy we still have in this country. Which has never been very high. For example, the great anarchist Emma Goldman has a very famous quote that people, especially people on the left, are fond of saying that if voting made any difference, this is a paraphrase, if voting made any difference, then they would have already made it illegal, right? But what I think that neglects is that for the wrong sort of people, it always has been illegal or prohibitively difficult, up to and including to this day. What I like to say is if voting didn't change anything, or at least didn't have the capacity to change anything, then people in power wouldn't work so fucking hard to suppress it. There's just if voting didn't matter, then people in power would not spend so much time gerrymandering districts. They wouldn't spend so much time in California, like they've been putting out fake polling boxes the Republican Party has. So it's just shit like that. And then, the first real civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, of course, there were movements before that and after that. But what we tend to think of as the civil rights movement in the United States mainly comes down to, what occurred in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of that, if not most of it, was really about guaranteeing voting rights. And so it feels like a disservice to people like John Lewis, who was nearly killed, right? Or the many, many other civil rights leaders, both well-known and less well-known, who literally put their lives on the line for the right to vote. It really does feel flippant to just say, well, I don't feel like getting out of my apartment that day.
What about you, Ray? You answer the question.
Yes, I do vote. We've all moved all over the daggum place for schooling, and I've always maintained residency in Mississippi because as a student you can get away with that kind of stuff. But yeah, I vote similar to what I think Jared was saying. I feel like when I vote for other people because as a white middle-aged male with loads of education and family that is solidly in the middle class, I don't feel like whether Biden or Trump or any of the last 10 presidents we've had would really impact my life, which is just the reality of being white, privileged, and male. But so when I vote, I grew up in a place where there's more black people than white people, which I think is not a common experience. And so when I vote, I think it feels like I tend to vote in ways that help or represent, the people in my community as opposed to just my own interests. So, yes, I do vote for that reason.
And I should say that we recognize it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, like voting for, the Democrats is not. I mean, it's you're still voting for neoliberal policies.
Yeah.
You're still voting for lots of egregious policies. But again, it's really about damage control. I wish that there were two functional parties in this country that you could differentiate between. But frankly, there's just not. There's one egregious, but, there's one egregious party in this country, but they actually can maintain like some sort of semblance of civility with respect to the Democrats. And then I don't know what's happened to the Republicans really in the last
populism,
yes.
maybe.
You can't even really call it populism. It really is just like, I know it's kind of an old hat to point out that like the Democrats and the Republicans are not that different when it comes to actual policy. Just the Democrats put on airs that they care about poor people when they really don't, and Republicans just don't care to put on those airs. Like it actually, like the more you can outright show your abuse of people that somehow aid you. Like I think that what's that? The woman that was running in one of the districts in Georgia, she favorably compared herself to Attila the Hun.
Jesus.
That's no joke, by the way. She said that she was to the right of Attila the Hun. Classic family
ruthless dictator.
Yeah. Classic Christian family values right there.
Although he did have one of the most awesome names, the Scourge of God.
It's pretty badass.
Pretty metal.
Yeah.
So, Jared, you mentioned that the different. So we talk oftentimes about how, or maybe we don't talk on air, but we've talked before about how neoliberalism represents both the Democrats and the Republicans. But you mentioned that there are some small, maybe marginal issues. Name some of those issues that can be used to add a little nuance to the difference between them, and if you have any concern for why they're important, suggest why they may be important to consider.
Well, certainly, I mean, I think women's health care. I mean, Democrats are better on women's health care. Democrats are better on gay rights. Democrats are, at least their rhetoric right now at the present moment is better on immigration. Let's not forget that the immigration policies under Barack Obama were fucking atrocious.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, basically the things that Donald Trump has weaponized were all put in place by the Obama administration. Like, you can't really say that their immigration policies historically have been better because they haven't been. But I think that there's enough recognition right now that going forward, if for nothing else than to demarcate themselves, apart from the really harsh rhetoric of Donald Trump on immigration, just the naked racism,
xenophobia.
Then they have to
worrying,
the jingoism, all whatever you want to call it, the out and out punitive treatment of immigrants. I think that going forward, if for no other reason than just the optics of it, Democrats will try to pass something on immigration. That's my expectation. Whether or not, once they get in power, who fucking knows? Like, they might not do anything. My expectation, really, if Joe Biden somehow manages to win, which I'm not confident that he will, assuming that there's not that Donald Trump doesn't foment some sort of political violence in the wake of an election in which he loses. Let's just say that somehow we manage to get through this nonsense in the next couple of months. I expect that what the Democrats will do is try to just turn the clock back to the Obama era policies and call it progress. But at this point, it legitimately would be, like, as depressing as that is, like, not actively destroying the country is somehow progress at the moment. And that's, again, no credit. There's no credit to the Democrats, right? It's no credit to someone to say that, well, they're not actively trying to destroy the organization or the administration of the country, right? Like, that's how low the bar is. It's not saying anything whatsoever positive about the Democrats. It's saying that one party seems hell bent on just deconstructing the entire country, giving the reins of power to grifters, and then letting them just exploit the system until it collapses.
So, Mike, you've lived in Georgia pretty much your whole life, right?
Yeah.
And that's a state that is currently going through some changes as far as like the pollsters say turning from red to blue or purple or whatever color you want to name it. I'm curious because, I've lived in Mississippi my whole life, and people always ask when you express your more liberal or progressive or whatever they want to call you ideologies, and then say, oh, you're from Mississippi, your vote doesn't matter. Do you think that your vote matters, Mike?
Well, that's a really good question. First and foremost, this is way out of my ballpark / comfort zone. But I will say, and I know we've talked about this before, I think locally, yeah, sure. Even at a statewide level, I have more faith in, well, I shouldn't say faith. I don't really like politics of any stripe, but I'm more comfortable with local politics than I am with federal politics, for sure. Simply because what we talked about last time, and that's the increased frequency of the use of the Electoral College, is, from my perspective, what little bit I do know about U.S. history is kind of worrisome for me. So, my vote didn't matter last time. I can say that. It didn't matter in the, 2000 election? It didn't matter then. So, in that respect, no. And then, yeah, Georgia, overwhelmingly Republican. I think that's changing a little bit. Places like Atlanta have always been more Democratic, but that's the kind of city versus rural dynamic that goes on in a lot of places. But yeah, that's the short answer.
So you think that the Electoral College is basically like taking away the meaningfulness of your political action on some level?
Yeah, and again, this probably sounds terrible coming from somebody who teaches U.S. history, but my knowledge of the workings of U.S. politics, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be somebody that.
Well, that's the reason why there's a civics class, right? Mike, in political science.
Actually, in the state of Georgia, there is no more civics class. So take that as you will.
No, I'm saying like that's not just your. Saying that's not your specialization.
Oh yeah. So, what was the question, Ray? I forgot.
If you keep hearing a dripping sound, it's not. Neither of us are pissing. Mike just keeps putting lime juice in his beer,
trying to make it taste better.
It's like 3/4 lime juice at this point.
Yeah. So as far as the Electoral College goes, I think this is a very hotly debated topic. And there's a lot of really smart people who have better opinions than I do. My concern here, we talked about this a little bit last time, but from a purely historical perspective, the rate at which the Electoral College is coming into play just within my lifetime The fact that it's happened twice already gives me pause and makes me worry a little bit. I don't know enough to say, like, I think the Electoral College should be abolished. Like, I don't have good arguments for or against that. But just the frequency of it is, in and of itself, worrisome.
I can give you a good argument. It's not fucking democracy.
Well, it's
just not. So the opinions, whenever you hear people provide arguments for, well, actually, the reason why the Electoral College is good is because it, gives a greater voice to this, population and this. Okay, but that's not democracy then. It's just not. If the majority of the population lives in a fucking city, then yeah, the city has more power to vote because more people live there. Like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Why should there be a proportionate number of votes relative to, offset? Why should a person in fucking Kansas vote count more than a person who lives, in New York? Why should a person who lives in a small district in South Georgia, why should their vote matter more than the people living in Atlanta? That just doesn't make any sense. People are people. It should be one vote per person. And that should be what democracy entails. It shouldn't be trying to figure out how to offset the balance of power in terms of regions. And that's really a relic of the late 18th, early 19th century.
Well, even that, the reasons for the Electoral College didn't really have much to do with mass population, because cities back then weren't anywhere near the level that they are now. The reason back then was because the founding fathers thought that, basically had no faith in the American people, thought that people were basically stupid and could be kind of misled and led into voting for a populist tyrant, for example.
You don't say.
No, but that's
and what did the Electoral College help us with there?
Right. Well, but like the anti-democratic statement.
I was just going to say, can we just, to point out the clarity there, that it's the opposite. What we're saying is the opposite for those of you who didn't catch that, because last time Hillary did win the popular vote, which would suggest that the people,
right,
by millions, by 3 millions,
by millions of votes. And again, say whatever you want to about Hillary Clinton. I don't care. I'm not going to sit here and defend Hillary Clinton. But at the end of the day, she won the election.
But like the point I'm trying to raise is, like, it wasn't meant to be democratic from the get-go.
No. This is the thing that everyone fails to see, from my perspective. Everyone thinks that the system is broken. And my argument is the system is not broken. It's functioning exactly how it was designed. It is functioning exactly how it was designed. It was built. It was a system built by elites for elites, and the elites remain on top. And it doesn't matter the degree of vulgarity which we happen to find with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is repulsive, but he is repulsive to elites, mostly at the aesthetic level. His policies are not, they are more punitive than some of his predecessors, but they are within the wheelhouse of what the right wing of this country has been advocating for decades. He's no different than a Pat Buchanan. He's advocating principles that people have been, wallowing in the thought of Rush Limbaugh for 30 years. This is not that different. People don't, elites especially don't like Donald Trump just because he's vulgar. I mean, he's distasteful to look at. Not just his physical appearance. Of course, there's that. If we're going to attack him at the ad hominem level, he's not easy on the eyes. But more importantly, everything about him, right? From the way that he eats his steaks to, just the gold toilets, right? He's tacky. He's a tacky person. And at the end of the day, what a lot of elites dislike about him is that, right? It's the reason why Michael Bloomberg put out fucking signs all across the country. Donald Trump eats his steak with ketchup. Like, who does he think he's turning off with that? Really?
Yeah.
Like, that's the best argument that a billionaire can put against Donald Trump, because at the end of the day, Michael Bloomberg has more in common with Donald Trump than he has dissimilar with him.
Yeah. Yeah, you're definitely not going to tell a Southern person that putting ketchup on something is a bad thing.
on a well done steak.
All they're going to say is, like, I guess there was an A1 sauce, so sure.
Right.
So, um, keeping that discussion going a little bit, Mike, what would be, if there was one thing, if you had, and this is kind of a two-part question, but we're going to start with like a policy or an idea. If there was one thing as a,
I'm going to say, I was going to interrupt just for a minute because I'm going to say one thing really quickly about that whole vulgarity with respect to Donald Trump, is that I think it's been demonstrated from his private discussions that Donald Trump is not as stupid as he lets on. Like, don't get me wrong. He's stupid. He doesn't read, and he is a painfully ignorant person who is remarkably incurious about the world. I think some of the vulgarity and the ignorance is intentional because, as you said, someone eating a well-done steak with ketchup may bristle, it may bristle some like foodies, whatnot, but country people don't fucking care. But what Trump gets to do when Michael Bloomberg says, "Can you believe?" Like he eats his steak like a pedestrian, pleb, right? What Trump then gets to do is to turn around and say, "Well, he's attacking me for something that you people like. So really, he's attacking you." Right? Like, Trump gets to pretend like he likes fucking monster trucks or whatever, and maybe his inner 8-year-old does. I don't know. I don't care. But whenever elites attack him for acting juvenile around something like a monster truck, then what he gets to do is to turn around and say, I like this stuff just fine. These elites hate you. Which is true. The thing, Donald Trump isn't always wrong about his criticisms of others, right? His criticisms of the elitism of the Democrats is not always off base.
it touches close to home, I think.
Anyway.
Okay, so I have another question. It's like a two-part question, and we'll start with this aspect of it dealing with like policies or something. So Mike, you can go first. If there was one thing that the next president or that anybody that you could do, let's just say you're benevolent.
Philosopher King, maybe.
Let's say that if you could push a button or make a decision, or if you thought there was any specific plan or policy that was looming overhead that people are talking about, or that you've heard or thought that could have the greatest impact on getting America out of the current shit show, not just the Trump shit show, but the one that, comes from the Democratic Party sucking so bad too, what would that be?
Jesus, Ray, I don't know. I think something, and I think this might be actually an area that we might get some agreement on between Democrats and Republicans. I think justice reform needs to happen sooner rather than later. I think our prison policies are antiquated. I think our drug policies are antiquated. Obviously, the police force that's been brought to the public's attention over the summer needs a radical facelift. Just immediately off the top of my head, the events of the summer kind of loom large on my mind, and then, personal experiences that I've shared with y'all kind of also bring that to the forefront for me. So that is like the very first thing that comes to mind. And I think, maybe I'm being a little too optimistic, but there might be some cross-political agreement there that could make that happen.
No, there's been some legitimate discussions. I don't know how serious they've been, but there's been some reaching across the aisle, at least in terms of negotiating criminal justice reform, because I think everyone recognizes it's really problematic. The issue is always going to be money, however, moneyed interest in terms of like private prisons.
Yeah. And so much of it works at the state level, so you'd have to put a lot of pressure on states to, walk away from those moneyed interests, which isn't always easy for them to do.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, that and also another thing that is of personal interest to me is also issues surrounding immigration. So that I don't have a good answer for at all, but something needs to happen that's been different from what's been happening for the past 4 presidencies.
Yeah.
That's where I would go.
What about you, Jared?
Honestly, I think that my son's basically apparently he's body slamming someone in the other room.
It's popping off in the living room.
Anyway, I would say 2 things. I think Mike's suggestions are really great, but I'd say also there is the specific issue of we need to have universal health care.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's atrocious and inexcusable that we do not have universal health care, especially when it would alleviate so many other problems, right? Access to health care would immediately fix a lot of social ills, including things like mental health issues. It would increase a lot of the poverty. I mean, it would fix a lot of the poverty issues in this country. So I think that if we had a public option or just a universal healthcare system, we would be drastically better off. In terms of reforming the system, however, I don't think that you can. I mean, before you could ever talk about like smashing capitalism, which is what I would like to say, right? burn down the fucking system.
Burn it down.
Dance in the flames. Before you could ever talk about anything even remotely close to that, what you would have to talk about would be something like trying to have legitimate and powerful reforms to how money enters politics.
Yeah.
We really need, campaign finance reform.
Yes.
Quite drastically.
Yes.
If nothing else, restoring Glass-Steagall. But really, what we need is drastic, long-lasting campaign finance reform. Because if you could get even some of the money out of politics, the thing is, we as voters, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, independents of all stripes, we step back and we look at policy initiatives which are supported by an overwhelming majority of the country. We see no conversations about them, and instead we see the most extreme and ridiculous propositions getting put forward, and all you have to do to figure out why is to follow the money.
Preach.
Things like, the barriers to criminal justice reform being things like the moneyed interest behind private prisons, which is such a private prisons is the most dystopian sounding term that is imaginable, right?
Speaking of Georgia, we have some of the most private prisons in the nation.
There's just no way that if you were to start a system from scratch that you would begin with the system that we have. It's the system built by inertia and by people constantly monkeying with things in order to eke out and exploit every little bit of money they can get out of the system at the expense of us all. There's no fucking justification for why we have a for-profit healthcare system. There's no justification for why we let millionaires and billionaires run our campaigns like public policy, and then they stick in, rich people and figureheads in order to continue to keep the pipeline running back to them. It's atrocious. You cannot have a functioning democratic system, and we manifestly don't have one. We don't have a democratic system. Arguably never have had anything remotely like a democratic system for lots of reasons, but specifically now, the biggest barrier is just the amount of money which gets spent in politics. Billions of dollars get spent on even small campaigns. statewide campaigns raking in millions and millions of dollars. It's unjustifiable when we have people who are going bankrupt because they can't afford health care, and the elites are spending billions of dollars to win campaigns against people who only have marginally different positions most of the time. Sometimes you have people who are in the same fucking party running against each other, spending millions of dollars.
Right.
It's obscene. Now, I will say again, like one of the arguments about voting is people say, well, why would you want to participate in a system that you recognize as corrupt? Well, granted, it's corrupt, but it's not the only thing that you can do. It's probably not even the most important thing that you can do, but it's in the toolkit, right? I think that at minimum, people should be expected to vote. At minimum. And then if you want to actually change things, don't expect that change to come just from the ballot box. The ballot box is one of the last places it's going to come. Instead, mass direct action is how you're going to affect change. Putting pressure on the powers that be, making them uncomfortable, right? Protesting, general strikes, the classic toolkits of anarchism, right? These are the things that actually drive change. Organize, mobilize, get out there and protest, do things. And people have been doing that, and that's the only reason why you see any real change.
What about you, Ray? What would you change?
I was actually going to say campaign finance reform too, because I think that in terms of I think Jared's right. The root of so many of our issues, going back to criminal justice reform, going back to, private healthcare, which is takes up private healthcare industry, amounts to like 1/4 of our, gross domestic product. It makes a lot of money. Overturning Citizens United with a constitutional amendment, which we haven't seen a new constitutional amendment in quite some time. I think that would not only effectively, get rid of money in politics, but also bring the country back together. And for those people who don't know what,
good luck with that. With the Trump administration stacking the decks.
Well, that's why it would have to be a constitutional amendment. So it would have to be, a constitutional Congress, which would require, I think it's 2/3 of the states to effectively vote in their legislators that they want to add an amendment to the Constitution, and then it would go up and be elected. And if it was done, then the courts couldn't do anything about it because they can't overturn constitutions. They can just uphold them. So, but yeah, I don't know if that's a far cry. I know there's work being done on that by some groups who think that that's a good path, but yeah, it's one of the, things that we've gotten to. I don't know. I feel like we've just gotten too used to either letting the executive orders coming out of a presidential office or the hope that you'll have court favor dictate our lives. And it seems like we really need to, as like people in the country, the only real and sincere change you can make that goes beyond just the whims of a president who's currently running or the whims of justices that, are alive and on the, Supreme Court at the time, is to do a constitutional amendment, So that was my thinking. But yeah, campaign finance reform for sure. Overturning Citizens United, or getting, rid of the basis for which somebody can make an argument that a corporation can donate money because they're considered a person, which is just fucking stupid.
Yeah, I'm definitely down with that.
In terms of, Jared, you want to say something? You have that look in your eye.
Just because he's sitting next to me.
I mean, I'm just going to keep harping on this because I think if there is an underlying theme to some of this discussion that's been voting, is just to say that nothing is gained through apathy. And I feel like part of it is we've been conditioned to think that, like, one, voting is somehow an extension of your moral personhood, right? Such that if you vote for the wrong person, then you are morally responsible for everything that person does in office, up to and including their marital infidelities.
Yeah, that's stupid.
And people act like they don't want to be contaminated, right, by voting for the wrong person, or more broadly by participating in a program by participating in an electoral system if they think the system has been corrupted or something. And I think that's bonkers, right? That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not responsible for what someone does in office once they've been voted in, really, because what I am doing is, again, trying to minimize threats. And I can only do that based upon, the amount of knowledge that I have about what the conditions are for this particular person, right? So I'm voting for the person I think is going to do the least amount of damage. And ultimately, again, voting is not the only thing that you should be doing. And so just those two things. One, apathy to say, well, I just don't want to vote, or saying that, voting doesn't change anything, or saying, more maliciously, I think, that voting will somehow, contaminate me if I vote for the wrong person. I think all of that needs to be set aside. You're an adult. If you're able to vote, you're an adult. Act like one. It's a basic civic responsibility. Granted, if you're well, who are you to lecture me? I'm no one, right? I'm nobody. This is my opinion. If you don't like it, that's fine. You don't have to follow it. But I would encourage you to vote, because again, I think that nothing is gained by apathy. The stupidest thing I heard I heard a very smart person recently, a person I've met, an intellectual I've met who I respect. He says that he doesn't vote, and his argument is, I'm not playing their game. Okay. That means that you're not winning their game either. I mean, what lesson do you think you're teaching the powerful by choosing not to participate in the system?
It's also a good argument for playing the lottery. Can't win if you don't play.
Yeah.
Voting
doesn't cost you money, really, though.
Exactly.
Time.
Right. Well, it does in certain cases if you're absentee balloting and you have to get it notarized like we do in Mississippi, which is a whole nother thing.
Oh, fuck you, Raymond.
But it's the way I've ranted about that before. But it's true. It is, apathy doesn't get you anything. You are playing their game. You're playing it exactly the way that they want you to if you don't vote, because that's exactly what half of the political spectrum in this country wants you to do. They want you to sit out, because the less people that are involved, the less power they have to share. And that's exactly what they want. They want to be able to control what you do and the decisions you make, and design the country in a way that will best suit them and their needs, and not give a shit about everybody else.
This is slightly unrelated, but it relates to this point. I was listening to a podcast recently that a coworker sent me. It's by the Institute of Humane Technology. It was about the 2016 election and the Russian interference in the election. And this was actually a tactic that the Russians used, specifically targeted towards minority communities. That we saw is that a lot of these Twitter bots and a lot of these fake news websites, one of the tactics that they used once it became clear that Hillary would be the nominee and that it would be her versus Trump, was a sort of an appeal to apathy. Look at Bill's policy towards minorities. Look at 3 strikes, you're out. Look at all this other stuff. You really think she's going to be much different? Why does your vote really matter? It was that appeal to apathy became a specific target that they were aware of, and that they were kind of zoning in on.
Yeah. So if you say, well, look, there's little chance that we're going to get a majority of African American males to vote for Donald Trump. Right? He's an out-and-out racist. So how can we affect things? Well, we can discourage them from voting for whoever the Democrats are putting up, and the outcome will be the same.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the podcast episode, but the Center for Humane Technology is a fantastic organization if you want to check
There's
it out.
also a film on Netflix which talks about the same point. It's called The Great Hack. And it's about it's specifically about Cambridge Analytica and their relationship to Facebook and the Trump campaign, because this was a Trump campaign Cambridge Analytica tactic as well, which is to encourage voter apathy amongst people who are likely to vote against you. And so, through social media has stores of information on people. So if you can figure out who is likely to vote for you and who's likely to vote against you, your goal is to try to encourage, to motivate people who are going to vote against you, and to discourage people who are going to, to encourage people who are going to vote for you and to discourage people who are going to vote against you.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, just don't, we're all philosophers. We teach intro to philosophy classes. We're, helping students gain a sense of what it means to do philosophy. One of the big, aspects of doing philosophy, teaching philosophy, thinking philosophically, is critical thinking, independent thinking, thinking that legislates itself. Don't fucking listen to Facebook. They don't have your interest at heart. They don't care. They are a corporation that wants to make money. Don't listen to Twitter. It's the same thing. Don't listen to Instagram. Anybody that's trying to shove an ad into your social media feed is doing that because somebody has paid them. That's the only reason. They don't care about anything else. They have tangential interest in your well-being because it makes them money to keep you happy, and that's really all it is. So,
and what do we call that, Ray? What do we call a system like? What do we call a system like that, Ray?
What do we call a system like that? I don't know. What are you talking about?
Capitalism.
Oh, capitalism.
It's capitalism.
Yeah. It's
people.
capitalism.
It's
It is capitalism. Yeah. So that does relate to the next question, and getting into political philosophy, because we occasionally dabble in this when we teach classes in philosophy. What's the next, if there's not a revolution or an evolution? Let's say an evolution, not a revolution. If there's not an evolution beyond democracy, if there's not somehow an evolution beyond democracy, something next that's like the greatest and latest and best way to align ourselves politically, do you guys think that there is another political system, a structure, a way of organizing societies and people who live in communities together that is better?
Well, democracy isn't really a way of organizing people so much. It is just the manner in which people make decisions. So, for example, like there's a distinction between like democracy, which is about decision-making processes, versus say something like syndicalism, which would say like this is how a community should be organized. So I have no problems with democracy. The issue is that we've never actually had a functioning democracy in like an industrialized country. We just haven't. We have representational democracy from people that don't represent us and don't have our best interests at heart and never have. And then for much of the history of the United States specifically, like black men, black women, women in general, and basically anyone else that the power elite have determined to be, unacceptable, have either been illegally kept from voting, or they have been, they've had their votes suppressed in various ways. Up to and including this election, right, where you have Trump encouraging people to go and be poll watchers, which is essentially encouraging Proud Boys to go and fucking intimidate voters, right? Which is going to matter less in Democratic strongholds, but in small rural areas, if you have a bunch of flag waving Trump supporters out there armed to the teeth, in visible distance from the polling place, if you're a black voter, maybe you say, it's not worth this shit, right? They're not going to count my vote anyway.
Yeah.
Why bother?
No, it's an interesting question. This has actually been a subject of historiography for a little bit. In the late 20th century, there was famous amongst historians, there's a book by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History.
Notorious book at this point.
Yeah, notorious because of how wrong he was. But it addresses this question, like what what comes after democracy, or is democracy the final answer? Fukuyama famously argued that history as we know it was kind of coming to an end, because in the 20th century battle between democracy and communism, that with the fall of the Soviet Union, that basically democracy had won the day. The issue, of course, is what happened in the 90s and the early 2000s with the attacks of September 11th and the War on Terror, is the rise of basically what amounts to like tribalism and the power of like populist thinking. So I say all that to say that the question of democracy, one of the things that Fukuyama just couldn't predict, I mean, and historians are notoriously bad about predicting things to begin with, but is how fragile democracy actually is, and how fragile the concepts that surround democracy actually are. And there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee even for the United States that the United States will continue not to like I'm like Nostradamus, like slightly Hispanic, overweight Nostradamus trying to predict the end of the world here. But like,
if America falls on the end of the world, it will be it will be the next phase in a long history of empires rising and falling.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to suggest that it's even going to happen, but one of the big critiques of Fukuyama is that there's no guarantee, and the way that the political atmosphere has been swinging, I think we're swinging towards more and more polarized positions. And I'm not sure that this level of polarization is entirely compatible with the democratic system. I know I might be 100% wrong, and hopefully I am. But yeah, I just figured I would bring that up.
Do you think that some of that is tied to how quickly globalism spread? Economic globalism in particular, because I feel like cultural globalism didn't go first. It's catching up, if that makes sense to you guys.
Well, I mean, the way in which technology expands is it's ever increasing, right? And so there's a critical theorist. He committed suicide a couple of years ago. It's a guy named Mark Fisher. And he talks about real capital. I'm trying to remember the terms. Some pedant is going to get really angry if I mess it up. So, it's called capitalist realism. That's what it is. And so, the argument behind capitalist realism is this notion that essentially capitalism has reached a phase at which it's very difficult for people to. Capitalism is really good about like absorbing even discontentment. So, for example, capitalism exasperates depression, right? But then it finds a way to monetize the discontent that it creates. And so people buy T-shirts expressing how discontented they are by capitalism, right? And in which case, capitalism has captured and monetized that. And so the inescapability of capitalism, the way that it needs new markets, which is a criticism that was leveled by fucking Marx. Like if you go back and read the Capitalist Manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, he talks about how global...
The Capitalist Manifesto.
Capitalist Manifesto. That's my next word. No, you read the Communist Manifesto, which is just a tract. It's not a major treatise or anything. It's just a tract. But even there, he talks about how capital will lead to globalization and how it will exploit markets until there's no new markets. And then the next phase of capitalism essentially is what a lot of critical theorists have been looking into, which is to say that what happens when essentially there are no new markets. And if you read, I'm just going to give a bunch of books now, just read Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, where commodification of everything leads to kind of like commodification of self, and so the new markets lead to all sorts of decreasing returns in terms of value of the commodities which are created as they expand. And so similar criticism was the late David Graeber, who unfortunately passed away, anarchist anthropologist, wrote the now famous book on bullshit jobs, and how, we are awash with busy work that creates no real value and makes everyone miserable. But that's, the explosion of service industry jobs, which I'm not trying to criticize anyone in the service industry. It's what's available to you, but no one wants that fucking job, right? It's a job that you have. It's not something that you want. It's mostly bullshit, right? So all of these things, I think that going back to Fukuyama, though, I think part of the problem with this approach is assuming that ideologies are important. This competition between ideologies, communism versus capitalism. One, economics are just an expansion of some basic premises, I think, that function in every society. At base, you have egalitarianism and anti-egalitarianism. And I think that that's present in every society and will be present in every society, and it will take on myriad forms. You have people who basically are other-centered, who think that collaborative effort and mutual aid are valuable, and that's how you should function in society. And you have people who are exploiters and want to take the surplus value of society and figure out how to apply it to themselves. And what we see in capitalism is essentially just the apotheosis of that tendency, which is to say that, the bourgeois class, the capitalists, these people are individuals who exploit other people's labor, create surplus value, and then, absorb all that surplus value in terms of profit. And then we figure out culturally ways to justify that, and then to go beyond justification to actually make it sacrosanct, right? So the people that we value most in societies are not laborers, but are, fucking Jeff Bezos. When in point of fact, if your basic orientation is towards egalitarianism, then you cannot look at a society which functions this way and see anything but abject horror, and look at a person like Jeff Bezos and see anything other than a monster.
Mic drop.
Fuck capitalism. So again, I think that the problem is people focus too much on what I think are second order phenomenon, ways in which we justify these two basic tendencies, right? But it has less to do with how we justify those tendencies in terms of ideologies, which become decoupled from this basic orientation, right? Instead, I think it is, do you care about other people or don't you? And you'll find some way to justify that position. And I don't, at the end of the day, this is the moral problem. I don't know how to convince you to care about other people if you don't.
Word. What's the question? I forgot.
Well, the original question was about the next phase in political schemes, but then we started talking about globalism.
Oh yeah,
and whether or not globalism economically stretched out its arm before the cultural globalism through technology, and if that has led us to some of the issues we're having right now. The basically the reversal towards isolationism, or what even more so polarization amongst small communities and cultures in America.
Well, I want to say one thing, and I think that Mike can build off of this better than I can, which is say that one of the problems with this Fukuyama's assessment was that it takes over Hegelian understanding of time and history. That there's a linear understanding that we're progressing towards something, and then the end of history is the culmination of something, which is a basic Christian orientation towards time that we've talked about before. But what I'm talking about is a cyclical understanding, to say that in all times and all societies, you're going to have these patterns. There's going to be these orientations. And it doesn't matter what sort of society that you're going to have, because we're not building towards anything. There's changes in society, but they're not always cumulative. We can have reversals, but we're not necessarily going anywhere teleologically. Instead, we're either progressing in one direction slightly towards a more egalitarian society or a less egalitarian society. But that's a decision which is made by every society. It's not a once and for all. We won't get to a utopian place where we live in a totally egalitarian society if we don't work for it. And it won't be maintained if we ever achieve it unless people continue to work for it.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. The assumption that history is teleological, I think that's blatantly false. The assumption that time is teleological is false. So none of that's really true. I mean, ultimately,
take that, Fukuyama.
Yeah.
And Hegel.
I mean, ultimately, it will all come to an end, sure, but that end isn't Anyway,
our efforts aren't building towards that end, necessarily, except to the extent to which we're destroying ourselves as a culture and society.
That end is not a political state. That end is the death of humanity. With respect to the whole globalism, capitalism thing, it's not really a point, but I think what fascinates me the most about this is it's more so a question of technology, and it's more so a question of kind of what technology has done to us. Because with the advent of the information age, I think one of the assumptions, which proved to be false, but one of the basic assumptions is that the information age, technology such as the internet, having information readily available to us at all times, that this would lead to a more maybe not intelligent, but a more well-informed, even if we just say a more well-informed society, even that we've seen is not the case. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. We live at a time in which you can literally learn about anything within a few minutes. You have access to all of it. But we are also living in one of the most tribalistic, political environments that has ever existed. And what recent studies are showing, and what they have shown, is that, in fact, these internet communities only reinforce our prejudices and only reinforce our tribalism. So it's having the exact opposite effect that I think a lot of people thought that it would have.
You can't have QAnon. You can't have QAnon without the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are two things that I think that raises, Mike, and one of them is just simply that you oftentimes don't get drastic change in somebody's life simply through providing them with correct information. Most people it'll just go over their heads, or it'll go in one ear out the other, to use tiresome metaphors. But the idea that somebody will have any drastic, political or tribalistic change in their life without having a real concrete experience to facilitate that, I think is problematic. So telling somebody that there's nothing wrong with, gay people getting married, or they're just trying to express their freedoms, doesn't necessarily hit home with most people who are anti-gay marriage, unless they have some sort of real concrete experience that can go along and facilitate that, where it's humanizing. The other thing is that I think there's a huge, I think it's no secret to me, or at least it's not some mystery, that with the rise of the technological age, the information age, we've seen a corresponding decrease in emphasis on, the liberal arts. And I listen occasionally to political podcasts where they bring on spokespeople from Facebook and, spokespeople from Twitter and stuff, and they talk about, we couldn't have known that this and this was going to happen in 2016, that these groups were going to rise up, that these groups were going to start creating this misinformation or disinformation, or we just didn't know that was happening. And it shows it's just a sign of naivete that any person with a semblance of a liberal arts background or humanities background would say these tools are going to be used to create just blatant lies, because people are going to do that. There's no check and balance out there for them. It's just about your ability to. I mean, we see this shit on our students' papers. I mean, if our students' papers were posted on Facebook, half the time it would be some of the most worthless and sometimes insightful shit that you'd get. It's basically just the internet written small.
No, I think the interesting thing is, like, you have not just the fact that people don't listen to fact checkers, but you actually have, as you said, and Mike said, like, the reverse of that is the backfire effect, where people actually will believe their nonsense even more after having been fact checked, right? Because, I mean, we don't have time to get into this, and I feel like we've probably gotten into it before, which is to say that, like, how people form beliefs is not how people think they form beliefs.
Yeah.
It's not as if you disinterestedly look at all this, all of the information which is available to you, and then use your critical thinking faculties and your innate reason to determine the most likely or most probable decision based upon all the available evidence. That's how people make decisions in an ideal abstract world, which doesn't exist, devoid of all, like, motives, in terms of, like, personal interest, all of the considerations of, like, your own faculty psychology and all these things. It's nonsense. That's just not how people think. It's not how people make decisions. It's not. I mean, you have to understand what motivates people. People are by nature motivated reasoners, right? And you can also, everything gets built upon your basic orientations and worldviews, right? So whenever you're introduced to a new idea, you run it through what you think you already know about the world. And if something conflicts, you have a choice. You can either change that part of your worldview, or you can reject the notion. And at the end of the day, it's easier to just reject new ideas than it is to reformulate, your existing worldview.
This is kind of tying, Jared, what you just said into what I brought up earlier. This is another thing that really concerns me. And I've heard, I'm sure there's smart people out there thinking about this and trying to find solutions. And hopefully I'm not being like a pessimistic, future, having predictions about what's going to happen. But this is what concerns me. So if you take human bias, if you take all of the cognitive biases that we have to new information, if we take what has been happening with social media and the information age, reinforcing these biases, reinforcing our tribalism, and this is what I think. It's interesting from a scholarly perspective. It's absolutely horrifying to witness in real life. But this is what really concerns me, is the fact that, propaganda has existed as long as politics has existed, right? Going all the way back to, the first empire builder, Sargon of Akkad. Like, what is one of the first things that he does? He writes a biography to promote himself, right? So that's always been there. What we're seeing now is the ability to produce propaganda at a level and at a pace that is absolutely unprecedented. Like, what's happening with social media and what happened with the 2016 election was another country who does not have our best interest in mind that was able to manipulate all of these biases and prejudices and tribalism that we are talking about in order to influence us in a very real, concrete way.
Yeah.
Like, that is...
It's actually quite genius.
Yeah, if it didn't.
It's crazy. I mean, history's going to look back on the Russians in this moment and be like, damn, that was some real strategery right there.
Yeah.
Way to poke holes in the democratic experiment.
No, it's completely mind-boggling.
And that's why I say, like, when you think of these people who are like, we just couldn't see this coming, and it's like, what do you mean you couldn't see this coming? From the day that we had sophists in ancient Greece, who were, basically the equivalent of a modern day pundit to, the first, printing press tracts of the, Western European world. We've had propaganda and people trying to peddle misinformation and disinformation to their own advantage. It's just part of what it means to be human. This is always a part of it.
Right.
All right. Well, that's an hour and 20 minutes almost, so we should probably call it.
Yeah.
It's been a long one. Jared's off tending to his young bear.
His baby.
And his baby. And it's getting late here, and we should probably call it a night. So thanks for joining us. Get out and vote, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.